Welcome to Dr. M's Vodcast, a vodcast with a mission to connect continuous improvement professionals across the world.
Hey, Happy New Year to you, all of y'all. It's Namaste. One thing good about Namaste is that it's time neutral. It's good morning, good evening, good night. And you welcome by saying Namaste and say see you again by saying Namaste. So Happy New Year to all of y'all. And we have the guest today, the guest speaker, David Bovis. And as I said, he's going to do his talk, and he said he was going to complete that piece of his talk in 10 to 15 minutes. I have received 7 questions, written questions. All of them have been passed on to David. So right now, over to David, and Dr. M stays silent till the end to say thank you very much. David, go ahead.
Brilliant, thank you, mate. Let me just share my screen. I've got a few pictures that will just help carry the conversation. I won't bother presenting it. I'll just flick through like this. So Dr. M and I had a quick catch up yesterday and said actually perhaps what we're all interested in is how we make change stick, right? Because it seems to be a bit of a slippery character. And I thought, well, just, I don't know very many people on the call, 2 or 3 perhaps at top. So I would just give you a very brief, literally 2-minute overview of where I came from, because I think we use words like neuroscience and very quickly can start thinking about theory, right? And that how do we prove this in practice? And Mark, you'll recognise I'm talking to your question there already. But I and my business partner didn't come at this from a theoretical or academic angle. We came at it from a practical, experiential background. So in engineering and manufacturing. So very briefly, let me show you that my background spans an apprenticeship working for a Marconi company called English Electric Valve, where I found I was bored very quickly. So I went and extended my apprenticeship to do plastic injection mold tool making and making medical devices, as well as other bits and pieces for big companies like Yardley and BT and GlaxoSmithKline. I then went into extrusion and dealt with a lot of big companies there and started getting involved with lean, as it was called then, world-class manufacturing, through different groups that owned these companies. I went to Teleflex Morse, where I was trained by the spin-off from Danaher, Colfax, with Mike Dwyer and those guys, and got whisked off to Germany to help with new capital venture investments to teach Hoshin Kanri. This is by the ripe old age of 24, I hasten to add. So I was lucky to get some good experience very early on, and dealt with big tier 1 people like JCB and Volvo Penta and different people like that. Then got into defence and worked with the MOD and the DOD on some high-level sort of technical stuff, where the R&D team was 75 PhD qualified chemists and physicists. So when I tried to talk to them about 5S, they would quote chaos theory back at me to prove how wrong I was, which was quite a challenge. Then I went into sort of what was pseudo consulting, because it was government backed, to give away money and help UK manufacturing, and went really from hydrogen fuel cell assembly improvements to quarrying 12-ton lumps of stone and lots of things in between. And then got poached by a CEO to go and turn this place around, which I did, but the investors pulled out anyway, so we had to close it down, which was a huge shame, because as you can see there, we were making lotuses out of hemp fibre, and all the inner panels for cars. So very much in the automotive sector all the way through all of this in various ways. And then got into ops directors roles. So went from anything from manufacturing shower doors to alternative food sources for taking pet foods into human consumption. So seen a lot of challenges. But before I went out on my own to do this stuff we're doing now with BTFA, ended up for a few years with a senior consulting group in the UK, the global Grant Thornton, and did some fantastic projects. So operational due diligence for investment companies like Total Capital Partners, rail and engineering projects for Newcastle County, and turning around car pressing companies that were failing, and applying for big grants and helping Cranfield School of Management get their MBA process improved. So as you can, let's say, an eclectic mix and a wide range of experience, right? So, and all of that based on world-class manufacturing, lean, TPS, as it's been taught around Europe. My business partner, I need to mention him. He's the bridge that we've got in Ducks in a Row to directly into Toyota. So he went to Japan and studied in Japan. He speaks 5 languages, including Japanese, double degree qualified MBA. You know, one of those really annoying people that are just incredibly clever and capable of doing everything. He became director of manufacturing, then engineering, then purchasing before he became country president of Toyota in Turkey. And he was one of the key members of the team that built the site in Turkey from a greenfield start to 240,000 production units a year. So he's a clever guy. He stepped out of Toyota and said he realized then that 80% of what he knew couldn't be applied because it was about the culture and the assumptions and the beliefs that were just held internally. So he had a bit of a shock when he went to Carson for a few years, but then went to MAN and had great success changing their fortunes as director in charge of operations for 9 years. So between us, we've got, you know, a lot of practical experience, and on the back of that, learning a bit about the Japanese approach and practicing Hansai from a philosophical principle of Hitokuri and building people, we've been able to, I don't know, just understand that there's something else that is required that's not really been there, especially from my perspective in what I haven't been taught through my career. So we both looked into philosophy, psychology, and theology to some extent as well. But all, you know, that all roads lead home, they say, don't they? And all of our studies alongside our careers led us to neuroscience. And I've been studying that now for 20 years, which led to me getting my master's in applied neuroscience in 2022 from ION. And it's what sits behind what we're doing now. So that's kind of it. That's how we've ended up together. It's because we saw the world the same way, even though we came at things from very different origins. We've ended up in the same place, which is, if you can understand people with the science to back it up, and you can get through the subjectivity that we've lived with historically, you are in a better place to make better decisions as a leader. And we've put it into practice for ourselves and had successes where historically we've had failures, and we're now sharing that with others. So in summary then, we can say we've led companies that, especially in Levent's case, bridge east and west theories and approach. Levent says that he feels that he was caught between two cultures. Interesting that he lives in Turkey, and Istanbul and Constantinople has got that historic link between East and West, and that's where he found himself. He says, you know, you can know lean, but you don't automatically understand Japanese thinking. And he can say that from a position of having lived there for many years and speaking the language fully. Me, on the other hand, I was working down the bullet points. I was working on this sense that there was some missing piece, but I have to admit, looking back on it, it was very directionless. I just knew we had to be able to do better because I'd seen too many people in too many businesses upset by the approach that was being taken and alienated and triggered to be defensive in their responses, and wondered why we called that approach best practice. So we failed as much as we've succeeded. I've had many change program failures to learn from, and been able to improve that success rate the more I've done around the stuff we're now teaching. We never stopped looking for what was missing, and we found it in neuroscience. So then we really understood the question we didn't know we were asking, which is, how do we help? I've put Western brains there, perhaps that's a bit of a provocative term, but how do we help humans, brains in particular, and what is taken for granted in that Japanese philosophical context that we've not really been able to explain? And you can put that under the banner of respect or whatever else, but we tend to focus on engagement and how people are disengaged by a lot of what's done in business. We're now showing what we learned, and we only see BTFA as an enabler of anything else that's done out there. It's not competition. It's not an alternative to. It's something else that comes from the world of neuroscience with facts and verifiable, demonstrable, repeatable facts about how human brains work that change the way we look at the way we run a business and the way we approach change programs. So it redefines what good looks like. And once we get that shift in people's belief systems, then they're in line with the model, BTFA, what people believe, which is how their brains are wired. They have to fire and trigger emotional responses in line with that neural wiring construct. So therefore, behaviors do follow that belief. So the root cause of getting people to change their behavior and perhaps demonstrate more respect in their conduct is changing their belief. And that's what we've designed BTFA to do. And very quickly, just to wrap up, because I'm taking too long, but you look at what other key names in this industry have found. Deming says, it's great to be able to do something, but you've got to be able to think a bit deeper, basically, and start challenging what you're doing. I guess everybody on the call, if you're from a lean background, will know that Deming, in his later years, came up with system of profound knowledge, which is that little diagram on the right, and recognizing, control charts, variation control, SBC, all that kind of stuff. But having spoken to Akoff and recognizing the value of seeing things through the systems lens, he also added in the idea of understanding more about psychology and people, probably influenced by George Elton Mayo. I'll show you a quote from him in a second. And the theory of knowledge, because that was what we called it back then. It was, how does a human brain or a human being know something? And the leading names in that field were Nanaka and Taguchi. So I think today we would add in neuroscience to link theory of knowledge and psychology. And basically, I think, we are saying is that we're doing what Deming advocated. We're questioning best practice through the scientific lens of neuroscience and asking if we can improve the way we approach change. And that's it, no more than that. Why should we settle and assume that what we're doing, if we've got, all these statistics in the world, like Gallup's 79% global average disengagement rate and those kind of stats out there, why would we assume that what we're doing is, good enough? Especially when we call ourselves, practitioners and advocates of continuous improvement. That doesn't seem to make any sense. So we have to challenge ourselves and think, how are we going to improve what we do? One more way to spin it just quickly is, I'm guessing everybody would recognize that equation. I can see those that are on camera, so I'm looking for any nods. Thanks, Colleen and Andre. So basically, that's the GE CAP process, right? The change acceleration process that Jack Welch invested in. And I think the story goes that he employed 3 of the big 4 and spent £20 million over 2 years to get them to work out the CAP with the change acceleration process. And the culmination of that is that equation that is the effectiveness of your change program will be equal to the quality of the approach you adopt times the acceptance of the people. And we seem to be very good at, evolving world-class manufacturing to total quality management, to lean, to whatever else it might be, and improving the quality of the tools and techniques. But we haven't historically really focused on how we share levels of acceptance in the people. And I think that's what we're finding we're able to do by introducing BTFA. So, and I guess really what we're doing is we're encouraging the use of a more definitive, accurate language through neuroscience than you get from sociology or psychology. But again, I want to reinforce the point: BTFA is not competition for any other method. It just enhances everything else. We can't afford to turn our back on what's been done. Last bit of qualification. Excuse me, I should have put that on silent and muted it. 1 second. That's it. Got my work focus on now. So Robert, a combat medic, first recon, Marine Division, etc., that came back into Civvy Street as a paramedic and then went to Fiat before he joined GE. We were having a chat before Christmas, actually, and he said this. He said the crisis of burnout and disengagement, across the world, really, with productivity at historic lows, which it is in all national stats from both US and UK, isn't a mystery. It comes from the failure to address what's missing: the connection, respect, and shared purpose. And I think that's really key. Those bold words there: how human beings connect, what it means to be connected and to identify with each other, to respect each other for how we are designed to function, and acceptance of each other, and having purpose, having something that we connect to neurologically really triggers the release of dopamine, which is the key chemical in a brain that gives us motivation to make progress towards a goal. So, we can now explain connection, respect, and purpose as in neuroscience terms. So, it's about releasing oxytocin for connection and respect, and purpose is dopamine linked, and excess amounts reduce happiness in terms of serotonin quantities and where those different chemicals feature in the brain. So we've just got this new language, this new layer of understanding that we can introduce. And when leaders click with this stuff, they really change their approach. So just finally then, I said I'd mention George Elton Mayo. These are two quotes I've picked out, as we all do, right? Primacy and recency bias. We all pick the bits that make us right. But I just thought it was fantastic that in the mid-40s, 1946, I think it was, wasn't it, around the Hawthorne effect that Mayo identified while he was developing TWI when he was at Harvard. He said job satisfaction, and this is out of a page from a document I wrote, so I've pulled the bit out on the right to make it a bit bigger. But job satisfaction increased through employee participation, and the critical bit neurologically is indecisions. It's about having agency. It's about being removed from imposed control because of the way the brain responds to that, rather than any kind of short-term incentives or short-term activities. And he also said the bottom bit there, it was the psychological response provoked by an inclusive leadership style that led to productivity improvements. And I guess most people would understand that that's linked to the Hawthorne effect that he saw at the General Electric plant. Oh, that was 1928, wasn't it? So I think that gives you some context. I am taking way too long. Sorry. The benefit of it is, we've kind of done what people like Nikau said. We found out whether it works by doing it. It's not theory anymore, and we've got results. We've got very good results with companies like GK and Aerospace, reported in the Times by JP Morgan Casanova for Melrose as a successful investment, where we've got this massive ROI, and the lead global transformation leader, Senior Vice President of Global Transformation, Philip Holt, said the program integrated BTFA and its success wouldn't have been as complete without it. So, and in his book, he elaborates on that. So you can see, I mean, we're now in a position where we've been doing this for a couple of years in anger in the market, and we've got decent clients that have been doing change for many, many years under different formats, and we've got excellent, financial and anecdotal responses that say how this is benefiting people. So that's kind of where we're at. That's me. That's who you're listening to, and we've got some questions to cover. So hopefully that positions things. So let me stop sharing. Dr. M, do you want to help me go through questions?
I'll do that. What I like is Eric, November 2016. You wrote in LinkedIn, but management is all about prediction. Remember that, Eric?
I was quoting Dr. Deming's quote of Michael Twitty, who was a Deming Medal winner. He said, management is not playing games, management is prediction.
Yeah. And apart from that, what I liked is that if neurosciences can help us to understand the human behavior, like you understand the process behavior through control chart, and if neurosciences help us to understand the A part of the equation. You asked what is Q. Q for many of us is any intervention, organizational intervention. It need not be, it was quality there, but any organizational intervention is a human resource intervention. Mm-hmm. So if that is not accepted, the neuroscience will help us to understand or predict what and help us to make that stick. That's the way I understood. There's a reason that this was recorded a year ago, and that's why I requested David to come across. Since Mark is on the show, I remember when Iwata and Nakao-san went and took a walk and came back and wrote No Good. Art, I think Gunashekaran sir and Mark were there, and they accepted it. They didn't say anything. I mean, they received it well. That was they adapted and they moved further. And I remember Art saying that in one of my episodes with him, he said Knockout told him that if you don't try, where will the knowledge come from? So, so that's the opening, and that's a reason that I asked David that let's come over. And this is one question that Eric, you have put up. David, you responded to this?
Yeah. So, and again, thanks for clarifying, Eric. I just going to pick up on the word prediction, actually, Dr. M, because that's a really interesting point. What we now know from the studies into neuroscience is the brain is a prediction machine. It's always looking slightly ahead. And long-term ahead, obviously, but in milliseconds, it's looking ahead. So when I'm speaking and you're, engaged and listening to my words, you will know what word I'm going to use. Okay, now most people would say next in their head, right? Because that's how quickly we predict all the time. And what the brain does is it says, does the inbound sensory stimulus, the reality, match my prediction? And if it does, can I move forward safely? And if it doesn't, then it puts it to a different level of analysis that says, well, hang on, that's not what I expected, which is why we have that pink elephant example. Don't think of pink elephants, and everybody only ever thinks of pink elephants because it's not something you expect to hear in the process. So the prediction piece is really interesting to link to that statement. But coming back to your questions here, Eric, you said about arresting forgetting. Is that right? Am I understanding that right?
Yes. almost everything we do in a change process requires some type of learning. If we didn't require learning, then we could be doing whatever changes we're trying to implement right away. But we need to learn something, whether it be in process or culture or interaction, some level of learning. For learning to occur, it needs to stick, and that's the forgetting process. So how do we stop forgetting? How do we arrest forgetting? Was the basis of this question.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so yeah, I can help with that. So I think what we have to do first is understand, in neurological terms, what having a memory is, or what having any kind of ability is, right? So if we think of the basic neuron, right, very simplistically, it's going to look like a hand down to an elbow, because it's got a cell body, it's got dendrites, it's got an axon terminal. Now, the way that works, if you go to the BTFA model, belief is the fact that it exists in the first place. We have to have wiring in place to represent any concept or thing in the world. So if you can imagine what a car looks like, it's because there's some neurons wired to represent a car, right? And this was proven many years ago with a thing called the Jennifer Aniston neuron experiments. We've all got a Jennifer Aniston neuron in our brain. Okay, so if we accept that to be able to conceive of anything at all, we have to have neural representation. So there has to be some wiring there. Let's call it wiring. For it to do anything, it has to fire. And I won't go too far technically, but from our micronutrient, sodium, potassium, ions, that kind of stuff, we get electrical charge that manage to get triggered by the chemicals getting into these dendrites, changing the cell body voltage and depolarizing. And when it depolarizes, we get a voltage spike. So it goes from minus 55 to minus 70. When it comes, or from minus 70 to minus 55, when it gets to minus 55, it jumps to plus 30. And it's that voltage spike that allows the signal to go down the axon and get to the next end of that neuron. And then that triggers the release of the chemicals that signal to the next cell, and it goes on and it goes on. Okay, so we have wiring and firing. And the stronger the firing, which talks to your point about elaboration, retrieval, practice, the more the brain has to process that particular wiring and firing pattern, the more what we call glial cells or glia cells wrap what they call a myelin sheath around this axon terminal. So the neurons get stronger, and which means they're able to process stronger signals faster. And so the things that we remember and we recall have got a stronger neural wiring representation. And so when we want to make sure that we get people to remember something, we can elaborate, we make the story stronger, we make sure there's more emotional response, because it's those chemicals that jump the gap that we call emotions, very loosely, I hasten to add, but it's the chemical mix in our brains and our bodies, which are neurotransmitters and hormones, which help to form that stronger neural wiring firing pattern. So if we've got a strong emotional response, we will remember more. And therefore, that's why if we ever got into a fight as a kid, or we've ever been robbed or mugged, we will remember the details about that, and we will have a more active response to any similar situation in the future than we would if we, pick up a loaf of bread in the supermarket. That's not gonna, we'll remember doing it, but it won't be something that's part of our survival mechanisms that affects the way we respond to our boss when they become a bit of a bully or something. So all of that is what sits behind the question about, arresting forgetting means strengthening the neural wiring and firing ability of the brain around a particular subject. And when we look at it from that point of view, we can come back to ask the question a different way around. We can say, what triggers the process of neurogenesis, which is the growth of new neurons, and neuroplasticity the most? And therefore, we can reverse engineer our solution from that starting position rather than coming at it from the other way around. And therefore, what we now know is that the same as I told you about myself when we got on the call today, the brain's designed to respond emotionally to story. So it identifies, I used to make a plastic injection mold tool, or I've worked in the automotive industry, or so the brain's always looking for ways it can make those connections. And when it does, that's when the wiring and firing pattern gets stronger. So the elaboration piece is really critical. I could go into more detail about cortisol levels and how we get oxytocin increases when we identify with each other, when the story makes sense. And then we can increase that with cortisol, can increase the amount of memory. But we also need to trigger some kind of answer so we get that feeling of progress, and then that increases dopamine. And if we increase the rate of those chemicals in the brain, it helps to promote another substance in the brain called BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And if that's the abundance, brains will adapt fast. And if it's not, then you have trouble changing. And BDNF is damaged by cortisol, and cortisol is the stress hormone, a glucocorticoid stress hormone. So if we stress people out, they don't learn. If they're in a happy place, they learn faster, is what it all boils down to. So hopefully there's some bits and pieces you might be able to pick out of that that answers those questions.
Yeah, that was really great. I think some of the things that you're saying are also shows up in Jeff Hawkins' book, A Thousand Brains, A New Theory of Intelligence. And I don't know if you've read any of his stuff, either on intelligence or A Thousand Brains. But he's memory is he calls it a sequence of patterns. And so you describe our brains also looking for patterns that we recognize. One of the problems we run into, and I've seen this as I have conversations with a lot of people in the lean world, is they don't understand the theory of variation that Deming talked about. And part of it is because they don't see it. And you know, it's like the helicopter that crashed on Mars. It was designed to see one type of surface. Like, I think it was a smooth surface. It was designed to be able to see and interpret. When it ran into a rough surface, it didn't see it and then couldn't navigate correctly. So it had no perception of what was right in front of it. And that's the same kind of thing that happens with, if we don't have those perceptions, like you said, if our brain isn't able to predict something out there, it's not even looking for it. It's a version of the invisible to gorilla experiment. But yeah, if we're not looking for it, if we don't even have a perception that it exists, we're not going to see it. And that's one of the struggles I think we run into sometimes with learning. And that's the question number 2 part, is how do we connect new knowledge to existing knowledge? And that's I think a key as well, is how do we take what we're trying to get people to do or learn or see and help them bring it into their world so they can then reconnect going back the other way. Like, we need to build that ladder and then they need to climb up it, but we need to provide the ladder that connects to them versus insisting they come to where we are. Does that make sense?
It does. Now, I'm a big fan of Jeff Hawkins. He done some great work with Dilip George years ago on a thing called hierarchical temporal memory, which explains and is into algorithms used now for AI and whatever. But also the John Medina, he recognizes some of this in perhaps more simplistic terms, in terms of how he approaches his lecturing.
Yeah, his book Brain Rules is wonderful, right?
Yeah, so it really is.
Yeah.
And he gives the example of the glinting knife in the nighttime, doesn't he? When he had a robber standing beside his bed, and how he had a stronger memory of that very quickly than anything else. But the connection piece is about identification again, and the trigger. I mean, the key here is not to trigger, and I'm going to use psychological language here, a defensive away from response, because the brain's always predicting what comes next, and it's already got a wiring pattern that knows what it knows. Its anticipation, its prediction is going to be to have something that sounds familiar, right? So even the fact of saying, if you know more about neuroscience, you can do a better job of change, that's potentially an away from trigger, a fear response trigger for people that are invested in approaching change the way they've always looked at doing it, right? So it's very easy to use language in very subtle ways that trigger defensive responses. So building that bridge, building that ladder between one brain and another, the key is not to trigger a towards response. I mean, you can get back into Jungian taxonomy and thinking about advance, retreat, dominate, submit, imprinting phases through childhood and all the stuff that goes around psychology. But I find it's much easier just to think of it in terms of brain function. And therefore, if you're going to trigger a fear-based response, which is the HPA axis, right, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the adrenal glands, there's all sorts of stuff involved with that, like CRF, CRH, and ACTH chemicals. But if you just understand the principle that if the brain is going to have something come into it to be processed, and the receiving brain is going to have defensive preservation approach if it's something new, if it's something it hasn't heard, and it will do that in milliseconds, you can kind of start to appreciate what the challenge is to be able to communicate anything that's not already mapped in that brain and not trigger that defensive away from response, because we've got a 70% negativity bias. The brain picks up on the negative and what's not recognized much more quickly than it does to what is recognized, because it's part of our survival mechanism. So, you know, we have to get that identification piece right. And if you can at the very early stages of any interaction, identify with the person based on their own experience, based on their existing neural wiring and firing patterns, you will trigger the release of oxytocin more than cortisol or any other chemicals linked to the stress response. So if that's the key, and this is why, you know, when we're introducing BTFA to new clients, I go to site, I meet the teams that the leaders are interested in coming through the course, and I have this kind of conversation with them so they know that we're normal human beings. It comes from a position of experience, but there's nothing to be scared of, and actually they might learn something that could be quite fun. And that's when we get better results, because you get it right from the start. And that becomes so important when you understand the brain function behind it all.
You mentioned fun for a second. Deming always opened his 4-day seminars with, "We're here to learn, to have fun, and to make a difference." And I think that element of having fun is kind of overlooked sometimes when we're working to implement change.
Yeah, it's crucial. I mean, the mantra I inherited from the Laird group and a guy called Sid Joynson, who had been out to Japan to study the Japanese approach as a UK consultant, he came back with the mantra: faster, easier, safer, and fun. And it wasn't until about 18 years later I went, oh my goodness, that's so profoundly wise, because when you see what having fun does to the change in the mechanics of brain function and how much faster people adapt and learn when they're in a safe space and they are able to have fun, it's incredible. It's so important. And we, like you said, we miss it all the time.
Yeah, so when you see work groups performing, when they get to that stage, fun is present. Yeah,
absolutely. So, and just let's cover your last question there, and then I guess we'll get Dr. M to show us a different one from somebody else. But the work and home networking, I mean, yeah, the brain doesn't really distinguish between, you know, where you are or what you're going to call your surroundings. It just knows that you have to survive your environment at all times, and its prime purpose is to help you survive efficiently. And I say that very consciously because it's about consumption rates of glucose energy. So depending on sleep, depending on how relaxed you are, what food you eat, how fit you might be, is going to determine, like John Medina says in Brain Rules, about oxygen levels, and therefore how much the brain can clean itself up with these other little critters in your brain called oligodendrocytes and astrocytes. These are going to work at night when we sleep to clean the brain, to use the spinal fluid to flush the brain and keep it healthy and able to function and cope with the next day, which is why we need to sleep each night. So all it's doing is to try and reduce the amount of glucose energy, because it's a very energy intensive organ, uses 20% of all the energy our body produces from our food. So it tries to take shortcuts, and that's when we start making mistakes in communication, in our thinking, making physical, practical mistakes when we're loading parts into a production or whatever else it might be, and whether we're communicating with the boss or the spouse. You know, it's going to make those mistakes if it doesn't have the right glucose energy. But there are lots of studies out there by Perry Jenkins and Porath and different people from various US universities that have now done longitudinal studies and have shown that micromanagement, imposed control at work by an overbearing boss who is not polite, and they put it under the term incivility. If you're incivil towards somebody at work as a boss, that person goes home, doesn't engage with their children, and the outcomes of those children in the future over these studies have shown that they have lower level capabilities in life in general, in terms of problem solving, social dynamics, potential at work. And effect, really, I mean, what it's really saying is, if we get it wrong at work now, the kids that our employees are having are going to become our employees in the future, and we're going to have damaged them before they even come through the factory gates. So, we've got to try and do better for society. And I think neuroscience gives us the knowledge we need to be able to do that.
One of the sources of this question came from Damon Santola's work on social networks, saying that we are strongly influenced by our strong social ties, not our weak social ties. So not the glancing ones that you get disease from, but people you interact with on a regular basis. And if people you interact with on a regular basis, if at least 25% of them begin to adopt a certain behavior or way of interacting, you're going to probably adopt that. And so he's got some good research on that. So that's why I asked this question, because sometimes we go at it simply at the individual level versus the group or organizational level through the networks, and trying to identify who's working together and how do we get those people who are working together to adopt it. And all it takes in a small group is maybe one or two people making a change, and then everybody adopts it.
Yeah, and we've seen the studies, and we apply the same principles, actually. I think if we aim to try and get to about 30% of the senior leadership team, and if we can get to 30 to 50% of leaders in a business to start speaking in a new way, to start framing things through this lens, then it cascades automatically, which kind of answers Colleen's question to some extent, I think. But it's about getting to that tipping point and of a new belief in what good looks like. And again, we're always talking about change, and sometimes we forget to balance it up, because it's always both sides of the coin. If you're exposed to the same people saying the same things down the same pub, telling the same jokes, playing the same darts or pool, your brain's going to reinforce that wiring and get stronger. So it's going to inhibit change, right? So if you want change to happen in the team or the business at large, you have to get the key source on the most powerful, most emotionally provocative stimulus, which is leadership teams, because we're a herd animal, so we default to the alpha males and all that kind of stuff. So we have to get the key sources of neural stimulus to change. If that doesn't change, and you take the lower level management team out and you put them back in underneath the senior leadership team that hasn't changed, what are they going to do? They're going to default to the same behaviors that has got the power. And that's what we see a lot. So it's about reaching the tipping point. So I agree with everything you're saying, Eric.
Thanks, David.
Brilliant. Dr. M, shall we see another? Mark. Okay. Brad. Brilliant. How can you use neuroscience to help convince? Convince. Brad, we tried that word. Through BTFA, we show people that it's kind of, it's a strong way to put it, but I would say, just speaking loosely, it's impossible to convince another person of anything, right? You can create the conditions in which they want to go towards something based on their neural wiring and firing patterns and psychological profile, if we want to throw that bit in. But the only way, you can't change another human being's brain. Most often, if we try to, we trigger that defense response, and therefore that other human being's brain reinforces his original view more strongly, but to be socially accepted might hide it and pay lip service to it, depending on what the social pressures are and its survival needs. But it's very hard to convince others. So what we've got to do is create the environment in which their brain changes to adopt that belief for themselves. If that makes sense.
No, it does. But I mean, I was really fascinated by you're in the discussion with Eric about sharing that that it's the strong emotions that embed memories in your long-term memories. And so what you want is, from a management communication strategy, you want to have your messaging, your stories that senior leadership leads to evoke those strong emotions. But that, and that's what I put in the chat, that runs counter to most high-level communication strategies where they don't want to be provocative. They want to be generic. They want to be calm, which drives basically, it just turns into, wah, wah, wah in the background.
Yeah.
And you go through these all hands and the senior leadership meetings that you come away with nothing because there is no emotion. Everything's generic. Everything's been homogenized out. And so it's just really a pointless exercise. And then if you try to raise that issue of, hey, I want to have a message that's considered provocative in order to drive some stronger memories and embed the message, then you're going to be attacked because,
Absolutely.
well, that's too provocative. That's too shocking. We can't have that because somebody might be upset. And so it's how do you balance that out? Because you have a senior management team intolerant of provocative or the raising the high emotions that you need in order to embed a message and actually drive change.
Yeah. And again, I think it's about whether you want to try and trigger positive emotional response, which is going to be those, chemicals like we've talked about, oxytocin, serotonin, linked to happiness and regulation in the prefrontal cortex, or whether you want to try and manage by fear. And I think this is one of the mistakes we made historically when we talked about burning platforms, right? Are the companies in fear of going under if you don't get on board with this change program? What did we expect to happen in human brains if we've just told the people that their job might be at risk, And let's face it, most people are quite clever in teams. And when we go and start talking about efficiency improvements, somebody somewhere says, oh, that means that you're going to need fewer of us and there's going to be jobs cuts, right? So what we want to try and do is come back to this idea of recognizing what the brain responds to positively, and that is being able to identify with a future outcome, because it's a prediction machine, of benefit for self, because that's what every human brain is primed to do. Going back to my training with Mike Dwyer out in Germany from his Danaher days, he said it's the fact about. And with him, he said it's the best radio station everybody tunes into, WIIFM. Right? So, what's in it for me, right? And the more I've looked at psychology and neuroscience, the more I found that that's absolutely bang on. Because of this HPA defense mechanism that we're designed to keep ourselves alive at a social level and a physical level, we only want to be safer in the future, which is why we try and improve the house we've got, the car we've got, the spouse we've got, whatever it might be. So if we come back to the point I mentioned to Eric about storytelling and what we reversed engineered into BTFA as a process and a practice, if you look at the neuroscience of storytelling, and it's the same cycle Netflix uses, right, to get us to binge watch a series. What they do is they get the identification. So you've got to identify with the character, with the circumstance, with the situation, with whatever. And that means the receiving brain has to have the situation presented in ways it can recognize because of its existing neural wiring construct. So it has to be, in a business sense, in the language of the receiving brains, not in the language of the giving brain. So when you get the CFO that goes and gives the all points bulletin on, the state of the nation financial report and is talking about EBITDA and return on capital employed, the people on the shop floor haven't got a bloody clue what he's talking about, and they all wander down the corridor going, yeah, what the hell was that about? So what we've got to do is try and convert the story into the language of the receiving brain, such that receiving brain can determine future benefit for self. And that's the trick. And that's what Netflix do. So the opening scene of any binge watchable series, and this is why we've created a 6-hour movie that people watch in our training, is to get that emotional connection with the character. Think, I recognize that challenge, that person, that life. And then what you do is you add in some drama and you put tension, because what you do when you get the identification bit right is you trigger the release of oxytocin. So you build trust. So immediately you associate to that person. So you trust your boss, you trust the CFO, the same way as you trust the bloke that played the rookie or whatever it might be on the series that we're watching on Netflix. Then you build drama. So then they've got some problems and some challenge, and it's like, oh my goodness, this could affect me, because the brain's going to process that as, how does that impact me and my safety, going back to some of the work Jeff Hawkins and people have done. And then what you want to try and do is provide a path to a positive outcome, but not all of it. So you get 80%, going back to 80-20 rules and Pareto, give them 80% of the solution, or what a positive future could look like to counteract that tension. And then you've gone oxytocin, cortisol, dopamine through the neural process. But if you leave a gap so that people have got to engage and think then for themselves about what the solution looks like, then you're triggering that mix of chemicals all over again in a different way, so that you get another burst of dopamine that is part of the seeking mechanism. People want to make progress towards that future state. So we talk about the same terms about future state, about goal setting, but it's how it's done that's more important than what's done, so that you get the right neural response. So I don't know if that makes sense or whether that fully answers the question.
No, it does. I wish we had another hour. This is fascinating, but I'll pass any more comments to get to the next one in respective time.
Just last point on your question though, when it comes to senior management, you senior managers need to know this stuff. If they don't understand it and don't believe in it, then they're just going to continue to function on autopilot, right? And do what they've always done.
Well, it's sort of like the senior management operates, lazily, just like the brain wants to. The brain defaults to a negative, you said 70% negativity. Well, that's sort of what the default for corporate is driving through fear, not positive reinforcement. So yeah, it really is a case of awareness. And how do you bring the horse? You can show the horse the trough, but you got to get it to drink.
Yeah, I changed that a few weeks ago on LinkedIn. I said every horse wants to drink. You've got to give it the opportunity to drink what it wants to drink. Yeah,
David, let me butt in. It was Iwata who said that when he led this Jiu-Jitsu group, and Mark DeLuzio will concur with me, that he said, we not only take the horse to the water, but we make it drink it. Okay, so it's not just a horse to the water.
Going back 35 years, when I first got taught anything about this stuff, I was told I had to drink the Kool-Aid. I didn't even know what Kool-Aid was. That's an American drink. I didn't have a clue what they wanted. Oh, brilliant. So I know we're on time, aren't we? So let's get through the questions quickly.
It's already up, sir.
I've got no end to this. If you want to run over a little bit, I can. If anybody else can, so happy to stay on. But Mark, 2 years ago, Mark, and I think we have spoken before about this with Colleen and Catherine and people, I would have probably struggled to answer this, but now 2 years on, the answer really is we've made the theory practical and actionable by creating the course we deliver, right? Which might sound like a bit of a cop-out answer, but it's for all the reasons we looked at the neuroscience and the psychology and reverse engineered back from that to say, how do you maximize and facilitate rapid neurogenesis and neurodevelopment in a human being such that we introduce this new language register to help leaders look at life through a new lens. So what Eric was saying earlier, if you haven't got, and as I would put it, if you haven't got a neural wiring and firing construct in place, which can be triggered to be in place with the right stimulus, then you can't conceive of anything. And I have a little bit of fun with this. I always say to people, describe to me a color you've never seen before. Right? So if you just went oh, and your brain stopped. That's because there's no wiring in there for it to be able to process that request, right? You can't describe a color you've never seen. So that's what happens when we want to describe leadership in terms of how do we maximize brain function. Leaders just can't process it. So the practical process to put this theory into action is teach people neuroscience, and that's what we've designed BTFA to do. And as you can see from the testimonials, it's working fantastically well, and we've got a growing business on the back of it. So I don't know if that answers the question any better than it ever did before, mate, but the answer is we teach people BTFA that triggers the growth of new neurons in their brain so that they see life differently, and that has to, because output of brain function is behavior, their behaviors have to change if their brain function has changed, and their brain function changes.
Well, it's crazy too, David.
Go on,
As I say, David, it's crazy because really, when the whole lean transformation piece, and I guess this is probably the same for any change, is that people need to view their business. In this case, it's a business through a new lens, right? And that it's lean. Everybody says lean is common sense, but it's not. Only because the way we've been conditioned to think about how we do business, But anyway, getting back to that color question, I'm colorblind, so I always see different colors. My wife and I always argue about colors, and she's always right. My son and I are colorblind. We have problems with grays and greens. But
yeah.
Anyway, well, thanks for the answer, David.
No problem, mate. But again, you're right, Mark. Just to build on what you've just said there a little bit, is that I've been watching your posts over the last few months, and some of the things you've been saying about original Danaher days and the approach to Hoshin Kanri, and when it's got that prerequisite element of Hito Zakuri and building people behind it, then you understand some of this neuroscience. You understand why catchball works so well. So some of the things that get said around that, are absolutely bang on. It just helps leaders understand how and why it works if they can understand the neural function behind it as well. And if they believe in it, then they do it, right? If they don't believe in it, they don't do it. It's an act of faith,
Right.
almost.
Yeah, and I learned the hard way too, David, that cookie cutter approach doesn't work, whether it's lean or anything else for that matter.
Yeah.
You've got to adopt it and get people to buy into and have it be their idea, and hopefully they're going to reach the right conclusion. But sometimes I'm wrong, and their conclusion's better than mine. Okay, so so the most important part I think is that they own the solution as opposed to what the solution is. Almost that's secondary sometimes. As long as you're not violating key principles. Okay, but that to me is probably more important than, and I think that's really what you're saying here.
It is, mate. Yeah, we Levent brings the phrase to the party principle-based practice, because that's what they talk about inside Toyota all the time. And he also says we don't recognize this term sensei. He said we haven't got senseis inside Toyota. People only get called senseis when they step outside Toyota. Up until that point, they're just normal people that are doing their job because the way they do their job inside Toyota. But it is, I like that term principle-based practice, because what we're able to do now is really detail how and why those principles work for the benefit of human brain function, whereas we perhaps missed that bit before and we focus too much on the practice and not the principles enough. So yeah, I'm totally with you.
And by the way, one last comment. WIFM, I never heard it referred to as a radio station, but I'm going to steal that. I love it. And if I need to pay you royalties, David, just let me know.
No, mate, you should know that was Mike Dwyer from Danaher that gave me that.
Mike, well, I trained Mike. Okay, I know Mike well.
Small world, huh? Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
No worries, mate.
You want to take
so
that?
Yeah, should we look at this question? We got time? Carry on.
Yeah, you want to ask? I have got no problems.
Okay, good. Well, if people can stay, you're welcome to, of course. So yeah, I'll keep answering the questions.
All those interested will stay back. All those who are not interested will go. Right. This is, I don't know whether you want to take a call on this, because this seems to be a judgmental question. So, want to take a call? No, I can skip this.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, if you have the capacity to take a poll, it'd be interesting. But I can answer it from my perspective right now. Perhaps not directly, but indirectly. Let's have a crack at it. Psychometric evaluations. In terms of aligning leadership teams, I think there's things we can do that are much better for alignment. So we've got an align element we teach, and what I say is, if you just imagine a very simplistic business model of 2 vertical lines and 2 horizontal lines, and the 3 horizontal phases represent senior leadership team, middle management, frontline, shop floor, right? And the 3 going across is very easily sales, operations, and finance, right? So now you've got a 9-box model, and the language register and the time horizons and the responsibility levels that each brain in each one of those boxes has to process is different from each other. So if you've got an ops guy on the shop floor, they want to know when they can get the next grinding wheel for the grinder, and wonder why the purchasing department has stopped them using that supplier. Right. If you've got a middle manager in sales, they're looking at quarterly targets. Right. If you've got the finance director, he's looking at return on capital employed and talking to the investors about their 5-year return on investment. So you've got different language registers over different time horizons, just to repeat what I just said, that are allowing each human brain to frame their world. Now, when we talk about identification, as we just did on the previous question, penalty one before that, then if you need to use the right language to get that neural wiring and construct to do the right chemical response of a positive towards, oh, I'm interested, what can we do with this, what's in it for me perspective, then you can't talk corporate finance to shop floor ops people or mid-level salespeople. You've got to try and get. So for me, that's alignment. Now, the other bit that's really stuck out to us in the last 2 years of doing this in practice, in its fixed standardized format of BTFA online experience, is that so much, and this is a little sort of inside tip for everybody on the call, so much of the language we use focuses on difference, right? And I'm not going to pick on any particular model, whether it doesn't matter if it's Insights or DISC or Thomas International, or Gallup and Enneagram. If you're a head person talking an Enneagram language, heart person or hands person, and you've got an 8 score on one or 1 score on another, or if you're an ENTP or an ENFJ, if you talk Kiyosaki temperament sort of, all of these things come from the same, I mentioned it earlier, sort of Jungian taxonomy. And it's all based on sort of 6 different factors, which is advance retreat, dominate submit, and matriarchal patriarchal influence through key imprinting phases, through biosurvival, emotional territorial imprinting phases up to 3 or 4 years old, right? And the baggage that leaves us with and we carry through life. So in that sense, yes, they're reasonably accurate, and that's why we all answer the questions as honestly as we can. We go, oh my God, that's amazing. That really describes me and picks up on things that I wasn't even perhaps aware of myself subconsciously. Whether they're any good for alignment or not, I don't know, because what it does is it really, I feel, is personal opinion, and I'm not attacking any particular psychometric approach. Like strengths deployment inventory is good because it does pick up on strengths rather than negatives more. And I quite like Belbin's 9 roles because that helps to get a balanced team if you can do that analysis. But ultimately, when you go past that level of understanding and get into the neuroscience, it focuses on difference. And I think this is a sociological issue that we face through language, is that we try and explain ourselves through our differences. I'm a shaper, you're a plant, I'm a resource investigator, whatever else it might be. And that means I've got this personality style that makes me good for this job, so that I'm good here and you're good there and never the twain shall meet. And actually, when we want community, when we want to, see English people tidying up the football stadium before they leave, like we saw Japanese doing a cup, when we really want to contribute to what's of benefit for all, we need to be focused on what makes us the same, what we can bond over, what we can see as similar. And when we recognize that we've got, let's say, just rattle off a few different brain parts to give you an example. We've got two hemispheres, right? We've got the cerebellum, we've got the prefrontal cortex, we've got the HPA axis, we've all got a hypothalamus, a thalamus, a pituitary gland, we've all got an amygdala, we've all got hippocampus, right? There are so many things about brain design that makes us fundamentally the same. What it means is we all share very similar experiences of life, whether we're classified introvert, extrovert, makes no difference. We've all had moments when we felt imposter syndrome, when we felt gut-wrenching fear of being discovered of doing something wrong, right? So what that allows us to do is recognize that if people have got something wrong, they're going to beat themselves up. We don't need to add to that. We need to give them support and the encouragement to help them find a way through it, recognize what they've done, practice Hanzai, apply Hitozukuri, and build the people. And I think so. There's a lot on the back of a short question, but I think they've got their place. I've used them myself. I think they can add benefit. I wouldn't think that they're that great for alignment, though, because they do focus on difference. And I would suggest it's encouraging people to focus on our sameness and what makes us human, to go back to the Toyota Way 2001 from Fujio Cho. Respect is one pillar based, or one foundation stone that respect for humanity sits on, right, as the pillar we need to build. So if we can respect humanity and accept each other, and what we see through BTFA is people's self-awareness massively accelerate, and acceptance of each other and compassion, then that's what we've actually got to try and facilitate if we want a herd animal like a human being to collaborate, to problem solve, to be in a mental state where they can critically think, and to be able to contribute to outcomes together, and be part of that shared purpose. So that sounds very philosophical, but hopefully that answers the question, perhaps in a bit more detail than I intended when I started.
David, I'll take
David,
one question.
one thing you mentioned. I'm sorry.
I'm taking one more question from the written questions, and so that I'm not said I'm gender biased, so I'll give it to Colleen. And comments are there. I will pass it on to David, and each of you who have made the comment, we will respond to you. Give us for 24 hours to respond to that. But this is the question from Colleen. David, all yours.
Okay. I touched on it a bit earlier, Colin, and I think I thought of it as I went through and called you your name out then when I mentioned it. But yeah, it's about, I think, if you think about how brains process the world, it's basically in language and images, imagination. And to be able to use those terms, language and imagination, we have to recognize there's a neural wiring and firing pattern behind it. If we can get that neural wiring and firing pattern to update and adapt to include knowledge around people with more science behind it, then leaders, the key influencers that Eric mentioned earlier, are going to have a different influence on the receiving brains. If we can get that to a tipping point, then it floods. So and goes everywhere, because we are a herd animal. I've used that phrase 3 or 4 times today. We do need social approval because it makes us feel safe, and our brains are conditioned to do that. So if those authority figures around us, those people with power and title and all the things we recognize as having to be deferent to through classical conditioning and life in the world, are going to start talking a different way and applying different, or sticking to different new principles, so that the practice is sanity checked against those principles, then you're going to get that reach that tipping point, and it will flood. And we've been pushed, Colleen, by a few of our clients now, and I know I'm talking to her, and I think she had to go, but I'm assuming she'll see the recording. I think what we've been pushed to do by a few clients is to offer a short redacted version that the masses can go through in just 4 hours. So when the leadership change their approach and their language, and people start to go, wow, what's happened to him? He's changed, because that's what we see in practice. Then they get to understand by a cheap, quick version of letting them see the story that sits behind the training we've given to their leadership team. And we also now do some coaching of sort of BTFA masters, so that we can create a coaching team internally to the client, because we don't want to be a company that sits on people's shirt tails and just drains the money forevermore. I always believe that you should work yourself out of a job, because that means you've really taught somebody something and they can do it for themselves. So I'm not interested in having the same client in 10 years' time. I want 20 clients that in 10 years' time are all doing it on their own, and doing it successfully. So that hopefully answers the question and a bit more.
We take 2 questions and then I can say namaste. There's silence.
Dr. Rem, just one comment I want to make on something David said in the previous question. Your comment about the fact that finance has different interests than purchasing, than operations, and all that is very, very true. And one of the failures that we have in any lean transformation is those conflicts that we can't reconcile. So, one of the things that we did at Danaher with policy deployment, we recognized that it wasn't good enough for any one function to be the best. We had to work together to have the best enterprise, right? And so I came up with a thought that said, every time you try to optimize a function, you're going to sub-optimize the enterprise. Okay. So our thought with DBS was, we didn't want to have the best engineering department or the best finance department, the best HR department, whatever, manufacturing. We wanted the best enterprise, and in order to do that, everybody had to work in concert with each other, right, and be all on the same page and not have conflicting goals. And I see this all the time in companies, right? So one of the ways we combated that was in what we call policy deployment at Danaher, which I put in the early 90s, which I now call strategy deployment. Some people call it Hoshin Conry, Hoshin planning, whatever, is that that's a multifunctional approach where everybody is invested from a multifunctional perspective, as opposed to every function. So we would never deploy Hoshin or strategy deployment on a functional basis, never. And because otherwise you go right back to what David said about those conflicts, okay? And so that was a big learning for us, because we changed DPS, Danaher Production System, to the Danaher Business System, thinking that we were really smart when we did it, but all we thought was, oh wait, there's waste in all these functions, okay? So we got to take waste out. But as we started really getting into policy deployment, it took a couple of years to understand this. We learned that these functions are fighting each other, okay, and they're compromising the enterprise and each other. So we needed to bring it together, and that's what the power of the policy deployment that we put in together had for Danaher to create a great enterprise. So people would ask me, is Danaher good manufacturing? Are they an engineering company? Are they a marketing company? And I would argue they're none of those things. Each function was as important as the next, right? Even though we were a manufacturer. So what you said earlier about those conflicts is unbelievably powerful, because I experienced that firsthand. I still see it today in companies that I work with today that still can't get past working on the same page. And a lot of it, by the way, has to do with the compensation systems, okay, and how people are paid, right?
Absolutely,
and that, of course, as you probably know better than me, drives all kinds of behavior, right? So anyway, I'll stop there, but I just want to confirm what you said was amazing. By the way, one more thing about these tests. One of my favorite ones was Dr. Jordan Peterson's Understand Myself. I took that test as $10. And what's neat about it is you can have your wife take it, and then he can combine them together and talk to you about how you need to work with each other. So when we did that, I got a personal call from Dr. Jordan Peterson. He wants to study me and my wife to understand how the hell we stayed married for 44 years.
Great.
Mark, I've
Sorry,
been
Mark.
there.
Which one
Mark,
was that again?
Thanks, David.
Mark,
Sorry.
although Mark ended there, but Dr. M's podcast started with episode 1 on the same basis called Flatlined 3 years ago, and the guest speaker was Mark DeLuzio. Okay, and the first
Yes, there
episode
was.
of Dr. M's podcast. So, talking with the brain, Dr. M does remember.
Well, wait a
Thank
minute,
you very
Dr. M. You
much.
got to tell the whole story. Wait a minute. You got to tell the whole story. Who created Dr. M? Your name?
Incidentally, Dr. M was created by another M called Mark DeLuzio. And recently he said that I created a monster, and then he added within bracket a good monster. Thank you very much. Namaste.